Many people regard you as a personification of Ubuntu. What do you understand Ubuntu to be?
In the old days when we were young, a traveler through a country would stop at a village and he didn't have to ask for food or for water. Once he stops, the people give him food, entertain him. That is one aspect of Ubuntu, but it will have various aspects. Ubuntu does not mean that people should not enrich themselves. The question, therefore, is, are you going to do so in order to enable the community around you to be able to improve? These are the important things in life. And if one can do that, you have done something very important which will be appreciated.
From WBRN Radio in Boston and on the Boston Red Network, the Open Source Report on the 30th of August, 2017. Brought to you by Cranston Software and Cranston Analytics, as we have been doing for a number of years here. There were some years we only had 2 or 3 broadcasts, but we're making it more timely. We're now on iHeart, on the Open Source Report, and various other outlets, Spreaker, and let's see, where else are we? Stitcher, and you name it, we are there. And we're coming to the Android channel. Android, incidentally, is moving to Oreo, and we'll have some on that probably in a future report as they move on to Oreo. I guess that would be 8.1, I assume. They're at, what, 7.1.7.2. It is a Linux kernel operating there that is partially open, and that is Google Alphabet, whatever you want to call them. In this broadcast, we'll talk about security, as we normally do, privacy, open source jobs, where they are, and GitHub, the open source projects there. We'll also talk about Cauldron, that is a newer project out there, and how to make a Twitter bot using Raspberry Pi, etc. And we'll put links to that particular one up there. And we'll start this off as we normally do with the kernel. The stable kernel is at 4.12.10. We are using, I believe, now 4.9.47. That is the latest one we have with our Slackware edition, which is 14. We are upgraded to the latest, and we'll upgrade again this week and see where we are there in terms of libraries, etc. We always start off in this direction. What we'll do now, well, we'll start here with, this is from the Black Duck people. We feature them on our Twitter feed, incidentally on our Twitter feed, Cranston Software, on our Facebook feed, also Cranston Software and Cranston Analytics. You can go there, like us, and get some of the latest news posted there, particularly on the Twitter feed. We're always updating over there. Nonetheless, this is from the Linux Foundation. Some of the latest key findings here. This is on the 23rd of August, and some percentages here. 89% of hiring managers find it difficult to find talent. 47% of workers are willing to pay for professional certificates. A lot of those out there. That's up 33% from 2016. Let's get your Linux certificates. Positions that people are looking, 73% are developers, 60% DevOps, 53% sysadmins, and are seeking expertise, of course, in cloud, web technologies. Cloud is 70%. All these are very close together. Web technologies at 63% and Linux at 65%. So if you're familiar with Linux and web technologies, you are moving along there. DevOps is another big one. And development, that is big also. Sysmin is at 53%. Less there. Some layoffs or redundancies in that particular area have been made, and we'll probably see that. While we are here, the Open Source Summit that for North America, that would be at the Marriott in Los Angeles, California on the 11th and 14th of September. This would be Linux.com, Container.com, Cloud Open, and New Community Conference combined under one umbrella name in 2017. The Open Source Summit and all Open Source Summits, you will collaborate, share information, and learn across a variety of topics with 2,000 technologists and community members. That's in line with our theme of Ubuntu, the collective idea. When we start off the broadcast, the former president of South Africa, Nelson Mandela, explains what Ubuntu is. Ubuntu was around before the software that is called Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a concept of community. It is a concept of community responsibility, a very old concept in the African situation, the African continent, across it, roughly 123 nations, and also the African diaspora. And now it is presented to the world thanks to the Linux kernel and the work of Linus Torvalds and many, many others, and all the projects we'll be looking at called them today, one of the newer projects out there. So they will, Linus will be speaking at this conference in Los Angeles. Christine Corbett will also be there. She is an astronomer. Moran is her last name. And various other Linux, Linus Torvalds, etc. So let's move on here. Let's get to voting security here. Can open source software. This is on the 10th of August by Fred Beals. If you're wondering about my opinions, I think we should stick to the paper ballot. That is from a hacker at DebCon 25. Voting machine software security needs to be improved dramatically and as soon as possible. Voting machines are frighteningly easy targets for hackers at DebCon 25. It took a few hours of white hat hackers to break into 5 different voting machines. One researcher expressed Polbrook system within 2 minutes. And a vulnerability in what is open SSL. Incidentally, in the Slackware distribution, we upgrade OpenSL, and you should have that upgraded no matter what distribution you're using, whether it's Ubuntu or SenseOS, etc. Another voting registration machine was found to use unencrypted SQLite-free database. SQLite is one of the world's most popular open source database engines, containing literally all the information that has been captured by the system. An attacker can easily obtain the machine's entire voter database, including names, addresses, and the last four digits of the voter Social Security number. Now, this commission that DJ Trump put out there, hadn't heard very much from them on voter integrity. We call it a system for voter suppression, but nonetheless, it would do basically the same thing. They wanted from the states. A majority of the states would not supply that information, as well as electronic facsimile of each voter's signature. The mind boggles of this havoc that could have been wrecked in the rest of the world with that information in a hacker's hands. For example, use a central open source software for a reason. There have been calls, including a recent editorial in the New York Times by the National Association of Voting Officer Executives to replace voting systems running proprietary software with open source. But while there are good reasons why the public should have open access to software recording our vote, open source will never be a magic bullet for cure-all voting security. No doubt about that, not a magic bullet. The problem and solution, going deeper than simply replacing proprietary software with open source. Open source software is not more secure than proprietary software, nor is it less secure, as yet another example at DCOM 25 proved with a hacker using a 14-year-old exploit in the Microsoft operating system to gain access to unpatched voting machines. And that's the key to any operating OS that you're running. You need to apply the patches, and most people don't. The argument could be made that open source vulnerabilities are more prone to attack. Some of those vulnerabilities are often widely reported. Open source exploits are often published simultaneously with announcements of vulnerabilities. With open source components making up as much as 90% of the average commercial application, open source is a rich target for hackers. A single exploit can compromise multiple software and applications, giving an attacker the biggest bang for their hacking chops. I like the way that's phrased. Whether open source project or proprietary code, most known vulnerabilities also have patches available from the date of their discovery. Both OpenSSL and Microsoft vulnerability patches available for years. They have been prevented the respective could have at DEBCOM. The open source community generally does a good job in discovering and reporting vulnerabilities. Over 3,600 of them were reported in 2016 alone. In other cases, a lack of insight, people and organizations are simply unaware of critical vulnerabilities. No doubt about that. Open source pull support model. Another reason of concern for use of open source in voting machines is that unlike most proprietary software, open source has a pull support model. That is, you're responsible for keeping track of the open source you use, as well as monitor vulnerabilities, installing fixes, and updating the open source your voting machine might use. Unlike an organization is aware that vulnerable open source components in voting machine software, it's highly probable that the components will remain unpatched and exploits. When it comes to open source, the key to security is insight and control use of the code, and this is where he finishes up. Open source systems are already playing a role in some elections. In New Hampshire, it has used them to disable voters to filling out ballots online or on the phone. If the open source model for voting systems gain traction, and effective management of open source security will be extremely important. Only with secure systems in place will election officials be able to maximize the benefits of open source while effectively managing risks. That is always the case out there. And citing politics should have been in place to ensure that all open source components in use were up to date, and that can be easily done. In the seconds at the DCOM, hacking a voter registration machine was easily compromised due to unencrypted LQLite database. And that was explained in the article there. And let's go on here to... I will come back to that one. One of the most successful open source projects have been common. This is from the Linux Foundation. Thriving open source projects have many users. There are now 60 million open source repositories, but the vast majority are a public workspace for single individuals. What differs, the most successful ones, the community is most of them are backed by either one company or a group of companies. And this is one of the things that here is a little bit disheartening on GitHub. And the Cauldron project, of course, is on GitHub. We found some people that were working there. But this is how it breaks down companies with the most projects in the top 50 base there. Microsoft has 24 projects. You'd be very surprised there. Google has 7, Pivotal has 7, Red Hat has 6. Red Hat has always been in the open source. In fact, Red Hat at one time was totally open source before they went into Red Hat Enterprise. HashiCorp has 2. Let's see who else. Learn.com has 2. Salesforce has 2. I won't go into all these, but there's some that have some. And if you look at this, is from New Stack, the number in open source projects. This is at GitHub. There's a lot of publicity out there. The essence of the article about Microsoft and Facebook, but they're not the only ones there. GitHub accounts, for example, Red Hat workers represent a significant number of contributions across a wide range in the cloud and container-related projects. So you may not get recognized for this because it occurs in a non-corporate organization. Moreover, it is common for companies to create a separate organization for popular projects, thus using the methodology. Google does not recognize it as an Angular project, but Facebook gets blank in reach. Anyway, some of the things out there, looking at that, the most active ones in the commercial space, they are up there. They have 207. The non-profit are MGOs, or whatever you want to call it, have, let's see, what do they have? They have 72. And in the education space, they're 46. And unfortunately, in the government space, very, very low there. There's 10. So that sort of explains what is going on out there. And we gave the breakdown of there from the New Stack, and that was written on the 26th of August, incidentally, from New Stack, and where well, we'll get this one. This is from Dick Hodel. Brings open source to VMware. VMware, I believe, just concluded their conference. The following is an interview as part of a series on open source leaders. Dick Hodel loves to keep a low profile in the open source world. He can often be seen as in keynotes with his close friend Linux Torvalds. Let's see. Okay, Intel is today one of the most Linux and open source friendly chip makers. That's interesting, because at one time AMD was, and that sort of shows you the direction. Thanks in part to Hodel. That's H-O-H. NDL. Anyway, hopefully we got it close. It didn't happen overnight. Hodel has been a part of a critical team that brought this change at Intel, because at one time it was not. Now Hodel is at VMware, turning into a friendly face on open source. Prior to a very long stint at Intel, also served as the oldest Linux vendor. That's Susan, as the chief technology officer. That was the German edition there. Hodel has a very strong education background, a degree in math and computer science, and he came across open source when at the University of Wittenberg in, I hope I pronounced that, in Germany. So that is his background there. And let's see what else we can get. He got involved with Linux. His friendship with Linus also grew stronger. Hodel still warmly recalls the first conference that was in the Netherlands in 1993. Over 20 years ago, 24 years ago, people were asking Linus how far Linux would go, and there were aspirations for Linux. He suggested maybe if we manage to fix a few more bugs in the TCP IP stack. That was back to release 1. I won't go much of this interesting interview here. I'd not read it before. One of the biggest shifts inside Intel was to get permission for workers to contribute to the left side projects. That's what they call open source. In 2004, he was promoted to the position of Chief Linux and Open Source Technologist. Technically, he was a Chief Technology Officer at Intel's Open Source Group, which is an accomplishment. One of the things that people have to understand, these are very conservative organizations. We fought at Cranston with Intel very, very long time to hire African Americans and other people of color, particularly African Americans and women, from the very time that we start out back in the late 80s, and particularly around 1990, 1992, etc. And some progress was made. And of course, when AMD brought their chip, we moved to AMD because AMD was fast with graphics, and we pretty much are still an AMD house here, although AMD has stumbled, but AMD is still in business. They have Razor, which is a very, very fast processor. We don't sell any of these. We used to sell processors, servers. We don't anymore. Anyway, from a team of 24 in 2001 to more than 1,000 engineers in 2016. That's a hellacious growth pattern there. In 2016, he was invited to join VMware as a vice president and chief open source officer. Unlike Intel, VMware is not known for significant open source work, no doubt about that. Explains that his role at VMware spans across a closely connected and interwoven area. His team drives internal processes around the use and contribution to open source projects. It comes to their overall engagement with open source and their contribution of many people, and I think probably that is in containers. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. Is never going to stop engaging in the Linux community, no doubt about that. That's Mr. Hodel was elected to the board of the Linux Foundation. Now, we have a long history of contributing to the Linux kernel, and I was able to add 2 top kernel maintainers to his team. And this is how corporate people do it. Linux Total at one time was supported in many of the kernel maintainers by Red Hat. That was in the late 90s, early 200s, and as the development moved on. The company's also has a growing presence in OpenStack. Red Hat is there also. GitHub features a VM integrated container engine. I thought they were. and lightware containers and Phantom OS container hosts. So that's where they're going up against some of the other projects here. Let me just very quickly here create your own radio station. We won't spend a lot of time on this, but there are some of the things that can be done in Linux, and a few programs you can get. IceCast is one, EasyStream is the other. LabShout, Shout is one also, and LabShout. In other words, if you download these particular, and we'll put a link here, these particular programs, and you can create a radio station, download the two programs and place them in a folder, and of course extract them, etc. And it gives the versions here of IceCast. What is it? 2.4.3. Easy is not a 0.6. Not. Anyway, if you get these, we won't go into all the details there, and you can run it on Debian, Red Hat, SenseOS. You can run it on Slackware. You can run it on any of the Linux distributions. And let's see what else here. Oh, basically that's it. Now to start streaming music, you need a type. Anyway, it's a command, a language type situation that you set up, Easy Stream, and you can stream music. And of course, anytime you stream music, you can be on the internet. So one of the little open source things here, this Easy Stream, it's a command line, a client began, and it began its successor to the old Shout utility. Has gained a lot of followers there. So remember Shout being around and what the latest version of it actually is. And we want to get back to make your own Twitter bot with Python and Raspberry Pi. And we'll put this up. Automate your tweeters with some simple Python code running on Raspberry Pi. Twitter is a wonderful communications and social media platform, which we already know. It's simple to write a Twitter bot, using a Python, and is a perfect tool to run the code, rather leaving a PC or laptop switched on permanently. And the API is here. Twitter is a web service that provides an application program interface. That is an API. I was talking to a lady not too long ago. Organization didn't have an API. Anyway, so start by going to app.twitter.com, create a new app by completing the required fields, and ensure that you select read and write under your application permissions. This will generate a consumer key, consumer secret, password, access token, and etc. And it is all here. To access the API from Python, you need to install the Twit libraries using pip. Anyway, I'm not sure what that is right now, but some of the requirements here, in addition to using Python to send tweets, you can also read tweets using, again, Twitphone Stream Class. Anyway, so the physical elements here, the Raspberry Pi, you can easily add physical components such as buttons, leads to your tweeted program. For example, you can set it to random tweet with a physical button to press, and it shows a nice picture of it. And stroll a tweet on a Sense Hat display. That's one of the things here. Read Twitter bots. Some time ago I created a Twitter bot called Pi Jokes. I'm not sure what that's supposed to be. But anyway, this is a Twitter bot, and we'll put it up. And let's see, we got the Open Source Summit. And, another piece of information, incidentally, here, and this is on the various outlets, what's happening here. The merger between Blog Talk, where we were for many years when we started the Open Source Report. We still have archives there if you go to Blog Talk. And Spreaker, where we are now, will be there in a few minutes. And this will be in the can, so to speak. But anyway, they have decided, this is on the 22nd, to merge. And they appointed the two companies, promised to create a leading technology platform, combining the entity as 50,000 podcasters and millions of listeners, no doubt about that, and a proprietary suite of creation and monetization technologies that enable podcasters each step of the way. Now, one of the obvious weaknesses here, they are not oversourced. That creates some problems. The Spreaker platform is much more advanced in terms of where they actually are. The sound quality there, and also Spreaker has partnered with iHeartRadio, where we are also. You can go there. So it provides another outlet. Francisco Baccinelli, he's the co-founder and CEO, will serve as the president of the combined companies. Spreaker's done an excellent job at Spreaker. As my friend H said, well, basically what happens there is Blog Talk is better known, better advertised. We first heard about them from the BBC, and we started in 2008, but we would have started in 2007. So what had happened 20 years ago, we created or contributed to an open source project that was run out of Real Networks, which you don't hear about anymore. But at one time, they were the streaming king of radio, and you got into copyright problems, but virtually any radio station could be streamed there, and they had an open source component. And I can't think of the name right now, but anyway, we got the code for it, and it would allow you, I believe, to have somewhere between 10 and 20 simultaneous callers to the server, or maybe it was to the server. Anyway, we had that information, and there were some others out there, and to actually build a radio station. And that's the idea behind WBRN radio, which there are other ways of doing it now, and Spreaker is excellent there, and there is some open source components there that you can use. We'll go into that in a later one. We went into a little simple thing there, the shoutcast, etc. But anyway, those are around and available. So the merger of these two is a very interesting situation, because you have users that are on Blog Talk, and they're also on Twitter and these other outlets that are coming into the mix. And there are many more. You have the mobile outlets, which are becoming more and more important with Android and iOS, which is the Mac situation there. And the applications, have to build our Android application. As an Android developer, I should be able to do that. But anyway, we'll build one for the new, we mentioned that Oreo, I guess that's 8.0, that's be the new Android. Anyway, nonetheless, with these two platforms coming together, and it's in the works, they'll be using, no doubt, this was at the podcast movement, would have known about that. Blog Talk recently released a big data audience solution called Cortex. Looked at Cortex anyway. Thus, combining this technology product with Spreaker's sophisticated mobile app and creation tool. The creation tool is a very good one for podcasters and for internet radio. Now, that is where we have a little bit of disagreement there. We've always called it internet radio. And part of the reason, and it still happens today, that you actually have broadcast stations that are broadcasting on the internet, and where you separate out a podcast. Incidentally, on Spreaker, you with other applications, and with Spreaker, you can function as a 24/7 radio station. We're not 24/7, but you can do that. So what we've tried to do at WBRN is combine our macroeconomics program, which is called Numbers Man, with Boston Red, which is our political program, and the open source report together, and BR on the world, which is kind of an international program there. And eventually we'll have All About Sports, which will be about sports. Now we do the Monday Morning Quarterback. We talk about sports. And the new program will not only talk about sports, but we'll talk about the economics of sports. Just as with Numbers Man, at one time we talked about the economics of IT, information technology. We still put that in. As we do here, we talk about privacy, not only the kernel, but privacy around the various open source projects. One other thing we'll just kind of hit here is from the on the privacy issue we have somewhere here buried. We'll do it briefly because we have plenty of time. This is the Electronic Frontier Foundation. They work in privacy, and a big controversy arrived in dealing with the neo-Nazis and the future of freedom of express. This is by Jeffrey Malcolm and Cindy Cohen and Danny O'Brien. This is on the 17th in the wake of Charlottesville. Both GoDaddy and Google have refused to manage the domain of the Daily Stormer. Now, it's cast by the Southern Poverty Law Center as a neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic site and European nationalism. Nonetheless, also Cloudflare, another service that protects against denial of service, DOS attacks. They were late to the party. And one of the interesting things about this whole battle, you have obviously freedom of speech. But going back to Oliver Wendell Holmes, certain speech is not protected, like hollering fire in a crowded cinema. That is a historical matter in constitutional law. If you look at precedents and how it naturally goes, or it does go in the law until it is changed. So thus that happens, and in the net there's been expression out there, but it is kind of a slippy slope. A person for various reasons could proclaim that you were, say, using hate speech, and take your domain down. I remember when we ran the O.J. Simpson domain, we were accused of putting out hate speech defending O.J. So in other words, this thing, we weren't taken down. The ISP, and I commend him at the time, refused to do it. There were some people that wanted it to happen. Nonetheless, the Electronic Foundation defends the right of everyone to choose what speech they provide online. Platforms have a First Amendment right to decide what speech does and does not appear on their platforms. That can be a little bit shaky, as one who presses constitutional law for years. And you get into that situation. First of all, the Googles, the GoDaddies, the Cloudflares, etc., are in the business to make money. And they were taking the money, and that was where the situation was. And, of course, when the domain registers refused to register them, I believe they ended up on an RU, a Russian site. I'm not even sure if they're there anymore. They went to what's called a dark web and moved. And that happened because the violent death of Miss Heyer in Charlottesville, Virginia. And Heather Heyer, in other words, and the reaction of some of those people to her death was the pushing a point. So we're having a lot of that out here as to where people go. Now, ISP is censoring their feeds, etc. And I've heard of organizations that were censored, like the Citizens for Legitimate Government. They've had problems with Google and some others. WikiLeaks worldwide, we should be concerned because organizations like PayPal refuse to collect money for WikiLeaks, etc. So in other words, you get into this situation whereas some countries prohibit certain things, like China, for example, and various others. Now, the censorship has been here for a very, very long time. But one of the things that happens with these so-called hate speech sites, that they have a number of things where they actually make money. That's like the fake news sites. They sell products. So in other words, it's not a revenue neutral situation, period. There are other methods that protect us against overboard arbitrary takedowns. It's noted that Google GoDaddy agreement to swiftly distance themselves from the neo-Nazis, whereas Cloudflare's Prince also admitted that the decision was not Cloudflare's policy. Policies give guidance. In other words, they can change policies willy-nilly. Part of the work for all of us now is to push back against such dangerous decisions with our voices and actions. Another part of our work must be to seek to shore up the weakest parts of the Internet's inner structure, and so it cannot be easily toppled if matters take a turn for even the worst. These actions are not in opposition; they are in the same end. We cannot and do not do both. Well, that is actually a factual statement, and the Economic Frontier Organization has been out there in censorship, net neutrality. They have sponsored it, period. And one of the things out there, you have Chelsea Manning here and some other people. Anyway, won't have time to go into this. Foundation announced today that whistleblower and activist Chelsea Manning, tech dirt editor and open internet advocate Mike Mesnick, remember him, and others are winners of the 2017 Pioneer Awards, which recognize leaders who are extending freedom and innovation to the electronic frontier. This year's honorees is a whistleblower, an editor, etc. So very interesting there. We finally have that in here. This will end our open source report on the 30th of August 2017. And we will have another open source report soon. So to wrap it all up, we talked about privacy, the Electronic Foundation there, and we also covered elections, election software, open source job opportunities, as one would say. GitHub, who supplies to GitHub. And before I forget here, we had Cauldron, and wait a minute, this is when you're moving along. Where is Cauldron? We almost forgot Cauldron. Somewhere here it was. Here. And it disappeared from us. I'm not sure where it went off to hide. Nope. Well, perhaps we'll have to do Cauldron the next time around, because for whatever reason it's not showing up. At least not where we can readily, as they say, get to it. Let me just make sure that it's not hiding somewhere here. No. Anyway, we'll get Cauldron interesting with machine language and AI in, so we'll get that the next time around, and we'll talk about it, and maybe we'll provide a link up, and we didn't get into it. Nonetheless, good day.